I'm William Graper, and this is The Recovering Elitist, a show that explores the space between who we appear to be and who we actually are, the tension, our transformations, and the truth behind success. Billy Cotton, welcome to The Recovering Elitist. Before I get into your credentials, I want to say that your work has such a clarity and an emotional through line. You can tell that you take time with every client and every space to really infuse a thoughtfulness, and your spaces feel at once contemporary while also feeling really rooted in history. So for those who may not know, you have your own design studio. You're also a partner and founder of an architectural design studio, CTK, and you're AD100's best designers in the world. But your resume isn't really what fascinates me. What fascinates me is your intensity about your work and how unapologetic you are about your attention to detail. You have a constant refinement of your craft, and you once said that you are such an intense guy, and that if a client is not seeking that, then maybe you're not the guy for them. So I'm curious, have you always carried that intensity throughout your life?
I would say yes. I would say it's been from day one that there's just been this, call it intensity, call it like zest for life, and just whatever it is that I was doing, whether it was negative or positive, it was just always very full throttle. I come from a full throttle family. My father was very hardworking and a real deep thinker and quite emotionally intense person. So, that's who I was raised by. And same with my mother. He was a psychiatrist. She was a psychologist. They were always, her more so actually than him, were seeking always a deeper level with everything they did.
What was life like in Burlington, Vermont? Like, what were those dinner time conversations like?
I was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, and then we moved to Burlington when I was 13. And all of my friends from Burlington, actually, on a personal note, my father recently passed away. And I remember
Sorry.
my friends, my high school friends were so deeply affected. And they wrote so many beautiful letters about my father. And one of them, there was a sort of constant through line of that none of them had ever heard adults talk with kids like that before. And that sitting at our dinner table, which was my mother's big cook, and the home, which ironically or non-ironically has become my life's work, was such an important thing to them. And yeah, those round tables at that dinner table, like it would fly between the headlines of the New York Times to childhood trauma to, what dinnerware we were eating off of. It was just a wild ping pong. And they kept saying we'd never been in an environment like that. And my parents talked to kids the way that they talked to their friends. There was no lines there.
And so you were always treated like an equal, it sounds like. Did you feel like an equal? Or did you feel you belonged in that setting as they spoke to you that way?
Yeah, I think that because they talked to us in this way and gave us this language at such an early age, I was really comfortable with older people always. And I was always shocked when I was disciplined or treated like a child, and which had to happen a lot because it's not the most well-behaved or successful child or adolescent. But I was shocked because I didn't perceive those differences like intellectually or, like because they had allowed us to. They brought us to museum, like they traveled in the same way with us that they traveled themselves. We didn't eat different food. We were all living together in a really, what now I understand, was a very interesting life.
And was the home something that your parents were very proud of? What was home, the actual physical home like life for you?
It was deeply important. It was in some ways the most important. And, not to keep talking about my father, but he was like a very unaesthetic person personally. Like he
Hmm.
dressed like a math professor and he was like very austere in that way, but he loved beauty. and he really supported it. And my parents moved into a big old house in Brookline, Massachusetts. Like, I think they bought that house like maybe 6 years before my sister was born. They were prioritizing that in early parts of their life. They bought a plot of land when they were in medical school that had, which they camped off of. He always dreamed of home as being the center. That's where they put all their money. That's where they invested most of their time, was like in actual the physical homes that they lived in. And my father, he built a house on Martha's Vineyard. He lived in this like old turn of the century house. He loved the aesthetics of WASP culture in many ways, even though it was so antithetical to him personally. And he was very serious about his religion and all those things. But he was he was a freak. I mean, he had a lot of dualities, and that being one of them. Like he would go to antique furniture auctions with my mom, and it supported all of her flights of fancy of filling the house with chippy old things. So
Mm. I love that freak and that duality because I feel that similar tension in me. There's almost a fetishing of some of other cultures that I think is now sometimes looked down upon, but the idea that like we can come from a different place and then really appreciate another culture and like make it our own. I've always been fascinated by that mix.
yeah, I think that was part of post-war America. And, to make it basic, but like the advent of air travel. And you were coming into kind of bohemian and intellectual period, which my parents were kind of a part of, where there was access. People were able to travel to Europe easily. People were able to go to Africa. People were able to go to these places, and there was dealers and textiles and all these things, sort of like a new generation that were popping up everywhere. There was African art dealers in Cambridge that my parents like loved to go to, and they were buying Keelam rugs and just various things that I think maybe 20 years before them in the, let's say in the 20s and the 30s in America, that wasn't even something that people would have had access to.
Do you think that design and objects has an ability to heal us or transform us and our past?
I think that beauty is a great balm and a great medicine, and I do think comfort is too. I read The Body Keeps Score like all of us, and I think that we all carry our own version of trauma and challenge and that. And there are people who beauty is the medicine for that comfort, home, all those things. I don't actually think that's everyone. There's a lot of people who in this world too, that is not what they prioritize or necessarily need. Like they're more experiential. They're more interested in movement or hiking, and look, nature is beauty too. So that necessarily that, but that's not an object. That's not your physical space. And I have a lot of friends who it's not a priority in their lives. I mean, that's a big part of my upbringing in Burlington, Vermont. And,
Mhm.
I still have a ton of really close friends living there. And that culture was very anti-materialist. It was like very, in some ways, looked down upon as kind of indulgent and wasteful. The idea that you'd spend all your hard-earned money on candlesticks or fashion or something like this. And it was part of the reason I had to leave, even though I really love, and I still love that place, and still I love those people, and I feel like my heart and my soul are there. But it's interesting that I couldn't really live the life or build the career that I could today in the place that I'm from.
You talked about the sort of unpretentiousness being something that stays with you. And I can imagine going from Brookline and having parents who really cared about those things and then being in a place where they didn't care about those things. Was there ever a part of you that questioned whether you should like beauty or objects? Did you ever fall into that trap?
No, no. I was really like a, you know, bull in a china shop or a flamingo in a,
Mhm.
you know, in a white box or something. Like I was always obsessed, from an early age. And I was like, my house was like the party house. And like, I was like, love to entertain, i.e. throw keg parties and stuff like that. But like, even that, like there was a level of like aesthetic quality that I cared about. And I would drag them all into that. And I would host dinner parties and I would set the table and do all this thing and have all my stoner hippie friends come over. And, they all played along with it. They thought it was funny. And I dressed deeply inappropriately, like for for Burlington High School. Like I was always like putting on these get-ups and thinking that it was some sort of fashion show.
Describe one.
It's too painful. It's too
I know.
painful. I always, yeah, I always think, wow, you really could have just, you were young, like you were young, you were
Mhm.
athletic, like you could have just worn Patagonia and it would have been okay. Probably would have worked out better from a historic photography
Oh
standpoint.
my
But there
god.
was a real Giorgio Armani had a really big effect on me.
Me too.
So I was definitely bringing that sort of, I don't know, I looked like a Italian mafioso or
Me
something.
too. What was that? I was literally, like, voted best dressed wearing, like, an Armani t-shirt that said, like, Armani on the front with ripped up diesel jeans and Dolce& and Gabbana belts. What was it about the Italian fashion that we
I don't know whether I went there, but there was a puka shell. Which now I've seen that I've actually been served some things in my algorithm that people are returning to the puka shell. But I wish, it's very hard for me to look at those photos of my neck in
Oh,
for
yeah.
4 years with
We're
those
not
puka shell.
highlighting the neck in our 40s. Yeah. In your 20s, you talk about a big turning point for you, which was a fire in your Chelsea apartment. And can you take me back to that moment and what that moment represents for you?
I mean, as I said, I really cared about things. And I had this apartment. I was at Hunter College, City University of New York, and kind of wild because there wasn't really that many dorms there. So I was living on my own. And I had decorated my apartment and I had all this stuff, these things that I cared about. And I had all these clothes that I really cared about. And it was tragic. It was like a horrible thing that happened. Super traumatizing to watch your house burn. I mean, I keep thinking about all the people who've just been through this in Los Angeles. But yeah, to be physically in a house fire is really one of the scariest things. And then the next day or the hours after, like I ran out with nothing. So I had nothing. And all of these things that like had become like the clothes that had become my armor as being like a young homosexual kid, and then this apartment and the things that I cared about in there and is gone. It's just everything was gone. I was too young and I was struggling. I was pretty wild. Was not the most centered person, if you want to say, if that's a kind way of saying it. So I didn't quite understand spiritually what I was going through, but I did go through it. I was forced to go through it. And I love having things. I love having a home. It's still very deeply important to me, but I am prepared to lose it all. I know that I will be okay, that my heart, that my person, my being will be okay without any of it. That is really about, is it joy to have it, but that I don't need it. And that fire taught me that lesson.
Sort of the spiritual lesson on the other side you can see now is like that in letting go, there might also be freedom and okayness. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that it really, at the end of the day, they are just objects.
Yeah. Yeah. But universally, what you're saying is also human in that if we can let go of people, places, things that are not serving us and know we'll be okay. It's a profound lesson.
Completely. Because that taught me about object loss. And then I've had to go through personal loss of losing people that I did not want to lose. And, I think that the act of saying hello and saying goodbye, they're equally important in terms of the joy equation.
Tell me the joy equation for you.
I'm still learning it. But my joy equation does involve pain or loss and it being able to live with that, and being able to talk about it and being able to know that I only can remain in joy and remain present and remain, not a jerk if I have some touchstone, some part of the equation in which is a reminder of how life can be dark and how we can lose something or everything in a moment. And I think that allows me to be a lighter, kinder person on the daily.
Isn't it interesting how those like heavy, painful life moments can allow us to feel lighter? I don't know about you, but working in fashion and interiors and just the material world can be very obviously exciting and great, but also kind of ungrounding. And some of those painful moments for me are immediately ground me in like a humanity that I'm hearing you talk about. I don't know how you would, if you would call it that, but
Yeah, I think it's in knowing what's important, like truly knowing what's important. And I think that is in terms of working in the businesses that we work in and in this material world, which comes with a fair amount of pressure and there's a volatility to it by its nature, because it's not, you didn't choose to become a work any more stable profession. And so it can feel so intense and it can feel so serious and real. And like oftentimes, especially in the beginning, it is like if it fails, if you lose the kind, if it doesn't get to the end, if it is not perfect, yeah, it can have a really deeply negative effect on the ensuing years. Like that is the reality. And so I think that to get back to like just the reminder of what is important and what takes us out of that place of fear, which oftentimes drives the like, oh my God, that furniture didn't arrive in time, and this person's going to be angry at me and I might get fired and that might be real, or whatever the thing that happens that makes us hold a little tighter or get more agitated. The larger things that happen, the big scale things, the sea change, losing your best friend or your parent or whatever it is, kind of to snap you out of that.
you had a relatively big pivot. You were studying Russian history at one point and you were dreaming of foreign services and then you end up going to study industrial design. Was it the fire that prompted the shift? How did that come
It was,
about?
it was actually, and this is the magic of this universe and like what we're talking about that like oftentimes like challenge is the opportunities. Yeah, this horrible thing happens, and I was at Hunter. I was trying to transfer, and had been working on this like big paper, this big history paper that was going to be my like proof that like I had a brain and I could do something on a higher level and all these things. And, this was before the cloud and all my backup floppy disks and everything, like everything burnt and it was gone and
Oh,
all my work was gone and all this 9 months. And I had been like studying in Italian and translating all these documents because this is before like Google when you had to like actually translate source documents and things. And it led me down a really dark road. Like I was flattened. I had fallen very deeply into addiction and I was really struggling. And I just kind of, I'd left school. That's a kind way of saying it, but I was not in college after that semester. And I was living out in Brooklyn, and I was really struggling. Like I was just scraping by, and I walked by Pratt. I literally walked by it one early morning, and it's this beautiful campus in the middle of Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, and there's gates and all of this. And I looked in and I was like, wow, it's really, I'd always heard of it, but because I had had like a fine motor problem, like my hands are pretty shaky. So like I never had like traditional artistic skill. So, and where I grew up, like nobody went to art school. Like that was never even an option. So I knew this, and I knew a lot of artists in New York. And I always thought, that's not me. I can't do that. And they didn't view me as that. And so I walked in there. I like literally just walked into the campus, and I just walked into the admissions office, like just randomly. And there was a paper on the wall that said first year that they were offering a BA in art history. So you could get into Pratt without a portfolio. And I was always, although challenged, I was always looking for an opportunity. And I thought, this is really nice here. And I'd studied a lot of art history at Hunter, and I'd worked at art galleries, and I was like really very passionate about art, even though I knew that wouldn't be my career. And I applied and I got in, and I went and I started in art history, and I thought, oh, well, it was good. I'll take some studio classes. And so I started taking some studio classes as part of my finishing up my degree. And I learned about what was offered. I learned about industrial design, and I saw people carrying chairs across the lawn. I'd never heard really of the field necessarily and what it necessarily entailed. But I said, oh, I care about chairs more than anything else. And it was really Julie Pochran, this incredible woman who was my black and white 101 photography professor. And she sat me down at one point, and she's just sort of said, what happened to you? What's going on with you? How did you get here? And why are you studying art history? And I told her a bit of my story, and she was like, I don't know what happened before, but I can tell you now that you have something special in your eye. And she wanted me to become a photographer. And it was the turning point. And I managed to weasel my way into that industrial design program. And I had to restart my whole bachelor's, which was a big deal, and then the journey began. And it was like my life really started over in many ways, certainly intellectually. Like everything I knew about my brain had to change. And I really had to open up this other portal into what it meant to make things and what it meant to be a creative. I'm endlessly grateful to Pratt Institute and to the incredible professors there who really nursed me back to life in many ways, and then set me off on this new life. But none of that would have happened if I hadn't. Maybe it would have at some point. No, I don't know. The fire kind of created the ground for me to be able to restart.
Beautiful. So you said we're born creative, and that the job is figuring out the manifestation of that creativity. I think you said that in my research of you. So do you think that the figuring out of that manifestation is something that we do we have control over, we can do with our minds, or is it kind of something bigger than us?
No, I think understanding our brains is very important, and I think that understanding the strengths and the weaknesses, and then on a very practical level, being able to figure out how those strengths and weaknesses work in concert to be able to show up every day for a job and make a living and work by the hour, and what that means. And how much are we going to try to improve the things that we are weak at? And how much are we going to lean into the things that we're strong at? And that, to me, is a relatively practical journey.
Yeah.
The spiritual part is letting go of the results of that. The spiritual part is that we do not, you can do all that work. You can train yourself. If you're bad at math, you can somehow, work super hard on that muscle and get yourself to understand the numbers. But ultimately, if you get into a job and your boss doesn't like you, or your coworker is competitive with you, and you get knocked out of that position, even though you work so hard on your weakness, that's something that you can't necessarily control. And having the negative results not become who you are, or like it becomes some wounding of who you are as a person, that's the spiritual part. But especially in America, figuring out how to support yourself as a creative person, I think that's more of a logistical.
How do you determine whether it's a weakness or a weakness you should work on or leave behind and focus on the strength?
How much conflict is it providing in my life? Like, how much conflict is it externally and internally? Do I feel okay? Am I sleeping okay? Do I feel good? Something feel tortured. And then externally, are people having a problem with me? Am I having some sort of financial issue? Is there some negative external, and saying that's because of my natural inclination to be impulsive or something like that? And I really need to work on that. I need to
Right.
figure out how to slow down, or
The consequence essentially of that thing and whether it needs to be given attention or not.
yeah. And if it's conflict, the consequence is that there's some level of agita with the world. Like, I usually try to, I've had a lot of things to
Yeah.
tackle over the years, but yeah, nip that way.
You talk a lot about service, and I've heard you talk about loving being a waiter and, having worked in retail, and that ultimately, as an interior designer, we are providing a service. And so this dovetails a little bit into what you're just talking about, which is like there's the art and there's the commerce, there's the creative and there's the practical. And so I think service is kind of a bit of both. But I'm curious, what interests you about service, and how do we most successfully serve our clients and ourselves?
I mean, I think I've always really loved making people happy,
Mm,
whether it was my friends when I was a kid and having fun, or whether it was being a waiter and having somebody have a great lunch or a day, and see them smile, and like me be able to be a participant in somebody else's joy, for going back to that word. And to me, that is being in the service industry, and being able to say, like, this, whatever what I'm doing is in service to someone. And I hope that the end result is that they're happy, and that their lives are better, and that their lives are easier. And like, I've done that. And I think there are certain people in this world that get something from that. And there's probably a lot that don't. I just happen to be one where it's like, I think that's one of the reasons I'm here. And to be honest, I'm really happy this is all working out for me. But I've always said, like, I could just go back to being a cashier and it would be okay, because I like that human interaction, and I like the practical thing of doing something for someone.
one of your bigger breaks came from designing Cindy Sherman's home, who is like obviously an icon and just one of the most creative people. I think we can all agree on that. I'm curious, how do you define the best clients or your favorite clients?
I've been really lucky. I've been really lucky that I've had people who challenge me creatively, which is like one of the things that's like the best, that have been kind to me, which is really amazing. Love that.
Mm,
Because kindness is like, they're supportive, they're good professionals. They engage in the business in an efficient way. Like, there's not, I think that's part of it, is like, we are running a business, and
right.
it is a personal thing. We're working in people's homes. It's furniture and fabrics and all of those things. So it oftentimes can be lumped in like a different category of not necessary, or not maybe involve the same level of professionalism that somebody would do with their accountant or their banker or whatever it is. But like, ultimately, like, it is a professional transaction. And I really appreciate when I'm treated the same as the banker or the accountant or all of that. And I think of that, I group that into kindness.
Yeah, I think that's so true that sometimes the role of designer can be taken quite casually, which is always wild to me because there's so many details and it's so much money and it's just does agreeability play a role in whether it's a good client or not? Somebody
Yeah.
who, you know, isn't really saying disagreeing.
No, no. All of my clients disagree.
How do you navigate that?
I mean, not, maybe not all of them, but no, I mean, he's ultimately it goes back to your previous point about service. He's not here for my house. And I think that also the clients that are coming to me, like, I don't have this like defined portfolio that they're saying, like, please deliver me this product. So there's always going to be a testing back and forth of both people. And I think that they know going into the process that that's going to be a part of it. When it starts to get really inefficient and wild, like that's tough, but I don't ever take the like if somebody's being disagreeing with what I'm saying, and then I'm in my mind, I'm not doing my job properly because I haven't found the thing that they want. I'm not
Right.
presenting what is representative of what they're looking for. So to me, it's more on me than it is on them.
That's beautifully said. I guess I think about your stance on your intensity and your passion, and a potential client should know that about you and have that be something they're open to and okay with. And so I'm curious to get to that place where you know yourself enough to make that statement. Were there times where people weren't okay with it, and now you're having to say, "I'm intense, get on board."
Yeah, I mean, I think like, look, you know, yeah, I think we all have different personalities. There are, and we are in a service job, as we just discussed, and there's like a certain level of warmth of a certain waiter. And me, like, I will just get straight to the point and I will give you my opinion in a very direct way. It was just interesting because, as I said, I am actually always thinking about the customer, but like, I will be
Mhm.
and I think that it's best to know that from the beginning because I think that it's a very personal process. And just as I can take someone's criticism of me, like that was a big thing in the early part of my career is like this whole concept. I don't even know whether this is like a proper word, but like personalization. Like the fact that I really took every criticism, every disagreement of saying, I think what you've designed is not right or blah, blah, blah. I took it as like a wounding thing to me, that I had done something wrong. And I think that was like a real journey and a lot of work to make sure that didn't happen. But I think actually it happened somewhat on the other side too. That, sometimes people, when I give an opinion or something like that, they think that it's a judgment of their own taste, or that. And I'm like, well, no, no, I don't. I don't want anyone to think that.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how our personal design choices, it's so easily taken seriously and it's so easy to become offended. And I too am very intense and very detail focused and I'm not for everyone. So I appreciate you speaking to that for us. I actually want to know a little bit about your creative process in terms of creating a relationship with the home because I've often said like I wish I could just sleep in this house for 2 weeks before I work on it just to like have create a relationship with that house in a way. And I'm curious if I know you've written backstories for homes and what is your creative process like?
I mean, I think certainly on the architecture side of what we do is like really like a lot about research of whether, if it's a pre-existing structure, what was the history of what happened there, both architecturally, maybe we'll look into who lived there, and of the place geographically, what has happened there. And then if similarly, if we're like working from the ground up, we're really looking at the land, at the place of the cultures that existed there, the history of that. And we're always trying to come up with these like research modalities of thinking about how you ground yourself in what was there and then really allow the client to say, this is the story that I want to bring to this house or to this place. I now understand what happened before. I understand a little bit about what maybe your perspective is, but it's really for them to say, this is the future that we're going to have here.
On the show, we always ask everybody what their toxic trait is. And you had said that yours was potentially being judgmental. That's also one of my big ones. And I guess I'm always fascinated by people who can admit that because I'm curious how we know the difference between what is sort of a trained eye speaking and what is sort of ego and separating ourselves from others through judgment. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my job is to judge things. I look at option A or option B like 25 times a day. And I have an eye of an editor that I'm constantly looking for all of the holes. What is wrong? What is wrong practically? What is wrong visually? Like that critical thinking is what makes me great at what I do.
Hmm.
Does it also make me judgmental? Yes. And does that sometimes creep into other things? Sure. I think it's hard for me to switch off is this right or is this wrong? And so I think that's something that I do think about. That's sort of what I'm thinking about these days. I'm sure my toxic trait will become something else in a week, a month,
Yeah,
a year.
totally.
But for today, I'm just trying to think about like, what does that mean? Is my mind and my heart open?
Mm. Few final questions because I want to get you out of here in the hour we promised. Is there a moment where you received recognition or status that didn't actually feel the way you thought it would when you got there?
I think that the sort of biggest, clearest example is probably like that big job that I had at Ralph Lauren, which really felt like this kind of in the lead up and in my attempt to get the job and do that, it felt like a solution. It felt like, oh, wow, this is going to really resolve a lot of things in my life, both creatively and logistically, and probably on some levels emotionally, because it's hard running a business. It's hard not having structure, hours, and all of that. And yeah, I remember like being in it and I remember thinking, wow, this did not resolve a lot of the things on that list. I mean, it also coincided with the pandemic. So
Yeah, the magical thinking of the perfect client or job or structure.
yeah,
I'm so guilty of that.
yeah. The solutions. I think that's also part of, if we go back to the joy equation, is like giving up idea that something is going to solve our problems or going to fill some need. Doesn't allow, not to get too like woo here, but just doesn't allow for sort of a natural flow of the fact that like life is going to serve you many different things, darkness, light, and it usually is all in some level of combination.
So true. You're like a master editor, but is there something that you can't seem to let go of, like an object that holds a lot of power over you, even though it's not stylish in any way, shape, or form?
I don't know. I mean, my Nike sweatpants
Yes.
can't live without them. Maybe some people would consider them stylish.
Yeah. It's people who keep old socks and they have the most perfect home. And you're like, that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah.
When you look back at your work, what's the one thing that you hope people will take away?
I hope that people will think about it. I hope that people will ask the question of who was the person who was living there or who was the person who designed that, you know.
Yeah. Well, Billy, thank you so much for being here today and sharing all of your wise words, and appreciate all of your beautiful work. Really, it's as a young designer who's I'm not young, but as a new designer, it's very inspiring to me to see you do such beautiful work. So thank you for being here and taking the time.
No, thank you so much for having me. I hope that we covered the topics that you wanted to.
Yeah, super fun. Thank you.
My name is Billy Cotton and I'm recovering.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Recovering Elitist. Our show is produced by Christopher Michael, Kelsey McWilliams, and Sasha Grinblatt, with audio post-production by Griffin James. Special thanks to Chase Coughlin for our original theme music and Justin Teodoro for our original artwork. We'd really like to hear from you. What are you recovering from? We hope you'll join the conversation on Instagram or at therecoveringelitist.com, and we hope you'll like and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes each and every week. Thank you for listening.